are y'all doing? Good, good. Normally, we would be playing board games today, but I don't know how to play board games. And so we thought we'd talk a little history this afternoon at 12 o'clock, and it being June, why not talk about D-Day? D-Day, the June 6, 1944 Allied invasion of the coast of France to attack Hitler's fortress Europe. What does the D in D-Day stand for? Depart? Destruction? I heard decision. All of those kind of make sense. The D in D-Day stands for absolutely nothing. Nothing. It could be A Day, B Day, C Day, E Day, F Day. They chose D-Day. I have looked for over 40 years to figure out what D-Day stands for. And the question was asked of Eisenhower, of Montgomery, of General Bradley, and it doesn't stand for a doggone thing. That's the letter they picked. D-Day. D-Day. The task of attacking Europe from England to France had been going on. The planning went on for 2 years from 1942 to 1944. The Allies, particularly Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, and to some extent Winston Churchill, had been pushing for a second front so that the pressure could be taken off the Soviet Union and Germany's invasion of Russia that occurred in 1942, called Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler decided to attack his allies. And so to take some pressure off of that, Stalin had been pressuring a second front that would take place sometime in the late spring or summer of 1944. The leader of those discussions and that planning was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's interesting that General Marshall and Churchill chose Eisenhower, and of course President Roosevelt chose General Eisenhower. He had never had a combat command, never. And it's something that bothered Eisenhower quite a bit as his career went on. At the D-Day battle itself in June 6, 1944, all the major players of World War II, particularly the American command and the British command, were involved. There was General Eisenhower, who's the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. There was General Omar Bradley, who would be in charge of the American ground forces. There was General Sir Bernard Law Montgomery, who had commanded the British 8th Army in the desert and had defeated Rommel. One of the major players who was not there, but was thought to be there by the Germans, was General Patton. When asked after the war who the Germans thought who the best American commander was, usually they came up with General Patton. General Patton had had a notorious incident in North Africa where he had slapped a shell-shocked soldier. That's hard to say. And Patton had come under censure from the media and had been rebuked by General Eisenhower. But it was kind of like General Grant and Abraham Lincoln. During the Civil War, a lot of people were concerned about General Grant because he drank a lot, and General Grant's lack of media savvy. And so a lot of people came to President Lincoln and asked him, why can't you get rid of General Grant? And he said, I can't spare this man. He fights. And that was kind of how General Eisenhower viewed Patton. Not that Patton had a drinking problem, but General Patton was an extremely capable Corps commander. He was extremely capable tank commander, the best without peer in the American Army. So they used General Patton as a decoy. to convince the Germans that Patton would be commanding the American ground troops going into Europe. And they had Patton commanding a fictitious army in England during the buildup to the D-Day invasion. Patton would go around making speeches. Some of those actually got him in trouble too, while he was giving speeches in England, whereas the real American Ground Forces commander would be General Omar Bradley. The logistics of planning such an invasion had never been contemplated before in the history of the world. The goal was to put over 150,000 American troops ashore in that first day. They also had to keep hidden as much as they possibly could from the Germans where the exact location was going to be. If you look at a map of England and look at a map of the coast of France, the idea was on the Allies that they needed a port city so that they could offload troops and materiel. The Germans knew this and thought they probably would land at Cherbourg. They didn't think, or Hitler could not be convinced, that the Allies would even consider the Normandy beaches as a possible landing site. But if you need a port and you can't attack one or acquire a port, what do? You build your own. And so the Allies engineers had came up with this incredibly clever idea that they were going to tow their ports with them. They were called mulberries. And there were these huge, long concrete ports that would serve to offload American troops and supplies once the beaches had been conquered. So the goal again was to put 156,000 troops ashore that first day. This operation was going to be called Overlord. The naval operation to support the Army's endeavor was called Operation Neptune, and over 197,000 naval personnel participated in D-Day. Over 4,000 ships participated in Operation Overlord on D-Day. The Air Force, 11,590 airplanes. Can you imagine seeing what that looked like, filling the sky? They were either fighters, they were either medium bombers, B-26 Mitchells, B-25 aircraft, B-17s, and B-24 Liberators. All flew sorties. Prior up to D-Day, over 14,000 sorties were flown prior to the D-Day invasion and on that day. Hitler's vaunted Luftwaffe had spent most of its time for the last 6 months in Russia. The Luftwaffe did not make much of an appearance on D-Day. Those that did were promptly shot down. So 156,000 troops trying to go ashore, supported by 197,000 naval personnel, 11,500 aircraft, and 14,600 sorties that the Allied aircraft flew that day. So there were 5 beaches: Gold, Sword, Juno, Omaha, and Utah were the 5 beaches that the Allies had chosen to attack. Those were the names given them. Gold, Sword, and Juno were the British and Canadian targets. Omaha and Utah were the American beaches that they were given to attack. The night before the invasion, Pathfinders, paratroops, were landed or parachuted into Allied into occupied territory in France. Their goal was to hold key bridges, key crossroads, and to disrupt Nazis' communication, to obstruct them if they should decide to bring up troops to contest the invasion. The German commander was who? Rommel. Somebody said Rommel. Was General Erwin Rommel, considered by many Allied officers to be the best German commander. One of the problems that General Rommel had was, who was his chief? Hitler. And Rommel had certain ideas about how the invasion, they knew it was coming. They knew it was coming. We knew they knew it was coming. And so Rommel had certain ideas about how this invasion ought to be counterattacked. And his basic premise was the invasion will be successful or will be defeated within the first 24 hours. And there's a famous movie based on what Rommel said. It will be the longest day. And so Rommel wanted to beat the invasion right at the beach. Hitler could not be convinced that these Allied landings were actually going to take place in this Normandy invasion area. He thought it was going to take place near Cherbourg, and so Hitler wanted the troops, the panzer units or the tank units, which is what panzer generally were, would take place, and he held those units back. Rommel could not get immediate permission to move those troops up, and so they were not supported on the beaches as Rommel thought they should have been and could have been, which was very lucky for the Allied invasion. Most of you, I know, have seen Saving Private Ryan. From everything that I have studied over the years and talked to survivors and participants on D-Day, the portrayal of that battle scene is pretty accurate. It's incredibly graphic, but it's also pretty factual. And so we didn't show that today for a couple of reasons, but mainly because I think most of y'all had already seen it. The landings, for the most part, in Gold Sword and Juno, the British-Canadian beaches, went well. Utah, America's landing, went well at Utah Beach. The one sticking point was Omaha Beach, where the majority of the American casualties took place. The Germans were well prepared. Their artillery, their machine gun fire from the cliffs overlooking Omaha Beach were pre-sighted. When the landing craft came up to the beaches to drop the men off, the Germans knew exactly what the range was, and the casualties highlighted that they knew where they were going to shoot. They knew the rate of fire. It was extremely difficult for the men at Omaha Beach to get ashore. There was, at some point, General Bradley, who was watching the landings from offshore, considered trying to pull off these men from the beaches and to call off the invasion. The problem was Omaha was in the middle of the forces. If you had Gold Sword and Juno successful and Utah successful, Omaha was right in the middle, and if they had to withdraw, those two areas would be separated, and so the Germans could defeat them piecemeal. Their men on the beaches felt like the commanding general. There was one named Norm Cota who said, "We are getting the hell kicked out of us on beach. Why don't we move inland and get the hell kicked out of us?" And so Norm Cota was able to gather men, supplies, material. They broke through the walls and eventually were able to push the Germans off the beach and on inland. Casualties at D-Day. There is some discrepancy in how many Allied casualties actually happened. Somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 men died that day from the Allied armies who were attacking the beaches. German casualties that day, between 9,000 and 10,000 were killed on that day. Sometimes it gets overlooked that there were a lot of French casualties, almost 5,000 civilians from the bombings that had occurred during the day and nights leading up to the invasion. It's interesting, if you go back and look at the relationship that Eisenhower had with his deputy commanders. Did he get along with General Montgomery? No. There's a couple of sayings, or two sayings, that I wanted you to, that I thought you'd get a kick out of. When the Americans came over to Britain, of course the Air Force had been there for years, 8th Air Force, but the sayings that the British had was that the problem with the Americans were they were overpaid, they were oversexed, and they were over here. The Americans got paid quite a bit more than their British counterparts, and so when the Americans would go out on the town in London or other English cities, they certainly could spend more money on their girls than the British counterparts could, and the British got upset about it. The Americans countered with that claim. The problem with the British was they were underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. And so there was quite a bit of rivalry going back and forth. General Montgomery thought that he should be the commander of the Allied force going into Europe. He did resent the fact, and as was pointed out to Eisenhower on many, many occasions, Eisenhower again had no combat experience. General Montgomery did. But for some reason, Eisenhower was able to coalesce a fighting unit and fighting force. One of the other problems they had with the D-Day invasion was the weather. Was it calm, sunny day in June like we have today, almost going to be up to 100 degrees? No wind? No, the weather was a problem. The tides were a problem. They had tried to plan a couple of days for the invasion prior to June. The weather didn't cooperate. The man in charge of the weather operations was a meteorologist named Stagg, and he never could give Eisenhower a very good weather forecast. It's amazing, isn't it? In the last 75 years, nothing has changed. We still don't know what the weather is going to do. We get forecasts from the weatherman, and it never ends up like it's going to be. Well, Eisenhower had that same problem. Eventually, they got weather that would be marginal, and so Eisenhower went ahead with that. The weather was not cold necessarily, but it was windy, rainy. Cloud cover, particularly that night when they were dropping the paratroops, made it difficult for them to hit their landing spots. And so, but they went ahead with it anyway. How many of y'all have been to the Normandy beaches? It's incredible, isn't it? How many of you have been to the American Cemetery? Again, if you've seen Private Ryan, they show some clips from that American Cemetery. If you see it in person, it takes your heart and breath away to see what these young men did on that day, that they could accomplish that. It's just an incredible story. We get, I did one of these classes a couple of years ago at a community and was kind of asking who was their favorite general of World War II. And it was interesting, the men that answered usually answered generals that they didn't serve under. I remember getting one man who had not served under General Patton in his 3rd Army, but thought Patton was a great general. He was in the 101st Airborne, and he didn't think much of his generals. But there were a few examples. But by a large majority, General Bradley seems to come off pretty good, unless you talk to the soldiers that served under him. They did not care for General Bradley. He came off or was advertised. Who was the great, trying to think of it, the media personality of World War II? Who wrote a lot of the articles that Americans would read back home about the GI? Ernie Pyle. And Ernie Pyle was trying to interview General Eisenhower one time, and he said, "Don't talk to me, go talk to General Bradley." And so Ernie Pyle talked to General Bradley and coined the phrase, the GI General, that the GIs really liked General Bradley. Here was the problem that they felt like in real life that they thought about General Bradley. He never came up to the front lines. There's pictures of him in the movie Patton holding a M1 rifle and kind of going to the front lines. Soldiers that were with him said he never did that. He was arrogant, very condescending, according to some of the troops that served under him. It's interesting to note that the movie Patton, how many of you have seen that? that do not give a very flattering picture in many instances of General Patton. The story for the movie was written by General Bradley's chief of staff. And Bradley and Patton did not in any way, stretch or form, get along at all. They just didn't. The movie portrayed that accurately, but it actually was more, there was a lot more angst going on between those two than the movie actually showed. Patton and General Bradley didn't get along, as we noticed. Patton and Bradley could not stand General Montgomery at all. Terrible relationships. Some of the lower ranking officers went on to greatness. Matthew Ridgway, who commanded one of the airborne divisions going in, ended up probably was considered by many of his superiors to be the best combat general during World War II. Matthew Ridgway, General Gavin, General Terry McAuliffe, all of those got great reputations going into D-Day. There's a story in the movie, The Longest Day. General Teddy Roosevelt, who was deputy commander of one of the divisions going in, and it shows him walking into the beach or going a beach with a cane. I don't know if y'all remember that scene. He was the father of Theodore Roosevelt. Not father. He was the son of Theodore Roosevelt, and they tried to talk him out of going into the invasion crap, but he wanted to be with his men, and it shows him going ashore with a cane. True story, by the way. And he died very shortly after the invasion from a heart attack. So he was not in great health. But it's an interesting story, I think, about General Roosevelt. What questions might you have about D-Day that I might be able to answer? Any questions about it or any comments?
It's a silly question, but it is coming.
It was the sectors given by the planning people that were planning the invasion. No, they were just the names given to assigned to each of the people that were doing it. Like I said, Gold, Sword, and Juno were the Canadians and the English, and for the life of me, I can't think. I should know this. I think Gold. I can't remember which ones were the British and which ones were the Canadians. I should know this. There's pictures of the Canadians landing ashore carrying bicycles. Doesn't mean they weren't casualties on that beachhead, but their resistance that they met was a whole lot less than what the Americans met at Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach by far, was the most contested of the beach landings. Yes, sir. Good for him. Good deal. I had a geography teacher at Harding. His name was Ike Hall, and he was in the second wave at Omaha and did well up until the second day, and he told the story so vividly. It's kind of beside the point, but I'd go in. He was a geography teacher, and he was teaching us boys. We were 7th and 8th grade at the time, and he was not a particularly good teacher. But when he started talking about D-Day, man, you could have heard a pin drop. I mean, these were 7th and 8th grade little boys sitting in a class. I mean, we were all just hanging on his every word. But anyway, he did okay till the second day, and then he said, I saw one of the German troops throw a hand grenade at me, and he couldn't get out of the way fast enough, and it blew one of his legs off. So he spent the rest of his life, for some reason they couldn't get a prosthetic device, but he was in a wheelchair the rest of his life. He He didn't bear any animosity, which we asked him, we were kids about it. Well, Mr. Hall, what do you, he wouldn't talk about that. He just talked about, others that got killed, and he was lucky enough to come home. We tried his patience one time, Mr. Hall, because we thought he was in a wheelchair. He was really weak. So we had spitball fights and paper ball fights. And he said, if I come in and catch you, I'm going to paddle you. Well, he's in a wheelchair. How hard could he hit? Oh. So if you're using these all day long, you're going to develop pretty strong arms and shoulders. So he had one kid bend over, grab his ankles, and the kid's kind of looking up, smiling, and his name was Ike. Interestingly enough, Ike Hall reared back and popped him, and I thought he sent that kid through the door. He just reared back. We didn't have any more spitball fights. And our grades got a lot better in geography because we paid a lot more attention to Mr. Hall. But he was just one of the best Bible school teachers I've ever heard. He was not a particularly good geography teacher, but he could sure teach Bible classes. What other questions or comments might you have today? Oh, they were all over England. Yes, ma'am. In fact, all of them were that supported the D-Day invasion. They were all in England. And again, there were all kinds of, there were B-24 Liberators, Mitchells, P-38s, which normally served in, or had served a lot, or would serve a lot in the Pacific, but P-38s, there were P-47 Thunderbolts, there were P-51 Mustangs, there were these big glider aircraft. The British had the Lancaster and Halifax bombers. They had the Spitfire fighters and the Hurricane fighters. It was just huge. Well, you can imagine close to 5,000 aircraft, what it would have looked like filling the skies.
And it was a goat roping.
Do what?
It was a goat roping. The whole flying thing was
It was.
There was no control whatsoever.
They couldn't control, which is why a lot of times they would overshoot the drop zone. They wouldn't get to the drop zone. The paratroopers were supposed to land. They had specific targets, and generally it was a crossroads or a bridge that they're going to hell or going to hold, and they ended up dropping in marshlands. There's a funny but true story from what I've been able to read in the movie The Longest Day, where the chaplain drops with his company. He drops in, lands in a marsh, and he loses his communion set, and he spends 15 or 20 minutes trying to find his communion set. And the chaplain, come on, get out of here. It's a neat movie, by the way, if you get a chance to see it. Also, I would recommend to you, and I'm sure you saw it when you did, or hope you did, on the 20th anniversary of D-Day in 1964. General Eisenhower went back to the beaches and had an interview with Walter Cronkite as they're walking along the beach. It's just magnificent. You ought to watch it if you get a chance. You can get it on YouTube, but it's just a neat thing to see. Who were the 5-star generals involved? Not that either became, who were the generals of that invasion that became 5-star generals, some of the Americans? Do you remember? Eisenhower? Bradley? In fact, Bradley was the last surviving 5-star general, and there's never been one since. Those two, in the American Army during World War II, ones that eventually became 5 stars, Eisenhower, Bradley, Mark Clark became 5-star. He was not, a lot of troops didn't like him either. But anyway, Mark Clark, I think that's the only 3, one in the Pacific. Who would that have been? 5-star, yeah, MacArthur. Yeah. Wouldn't it have been interesting if you'd seen roles reversed if MacArthur had been in Europe and Eisenhower had been in the Pacific? Interesting, isn't it, to think what would have been different? Supposedly at the end of World War II, Patton wanted to be sent over to the Pacific, and they asked MacArthur about it. I can't see MacArthur and Patton getting along. I mean, two prima donnas, I don't think would have worked very well. But anyway, now Patton eventually, right before he died, was given 4-star rank. So he retired or was killed when he was a full general. Yes, sir.
It seems like from the Air Force support in they large failure task that they set out to do. Is that your impression as well, or?
Well, from what I've read about it, there was, and Mr. Williams pointed some of that out. One main thing, they were trying not to give away what they were going to do. So some of the bombings that they were doing prior to D-Day, they weren't able to hit targets that they thought they should have been able to hit because they didn't want to give away where the Allies were landing. Well, if you're not hitting the targets, you're not going to help guys that are coming ashore. So, no, and these troops, the German troops, had been positioned back far enough away from the coast that the Allies didn't know particularly where they were. And so, in some ways, the bombings were a failure. They killed an awful lot of civilians, French civilians. They were kind of successful in kind of destroying some train yards. Germans learned to move at night. And again, the Germans did not have much of an Air Force presence at all, so the Allied Air Forces were free pretty much to do what they wanted to. It was not until a little later in the war that ground infantry support from aircraft was developed, and it was more developed in the Pacific. They had the better aircraft to do it at that time. They didn't know exactly how to coordinate. You know, you call in an airstrike, you see, you know, Vietnam, Korea, you know, current wars in Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They did not learn how to do that. Had not learned how to do that very well by now. Well, they were training them quickly. They were trying to get them into service. In fact, if you go back and look, I almost read that some of the aircraft. For some reason, the B-24 Liberator was really hard to fly, and they killed more. There were more pilots killed in Liberators on training exercises than were killed by enemy forces, which I find amazing. But they just, and there was some characteristics about, particularly on takeoff with that plane, that they just could not get right, and so it killed a lot of them. I had the opportunity, and some of y'all might have done this, but years ago. They had these, they still do, I guess, next to COVID, but they have air shows. And there was a B-17 that was flyable, and I got to fly in a B-17. They would fly down, you could pay X amount of dollars, and they would take a group up in that aircraft. I mean, it was incredible. I have to tell you, I was a little nervous. Because they give you headphones, but I can imagine flying in it and not having those and the roar of the engines. It ain't like flying in an 0737. I mean, you're vibrating the whole time. I mean, it was, I thought, man, this is... Well, there you go, and freezing your can off and worried about, you know, Messerschmitts coming down to shoot you out of the sky. So it was an exhilarating, probably something I would never do it again. Now, one of those B-17s crashed. So I don't know that they're doing that with anything anymore. You can go down to, if you go down to World War II Museum, or D-Day Museum in New Orleans, and doesn't have anything to do with D-Day, but you can get a ride on a PT boat. And they'll take you out on Lake Pontchartrain and let you fly around on the boat for a while. I don't know what that costs, but I think that'd be kind of fun too. Anything else? Thank you. Y'all are a good group. It's been fun. Next week, those of y'all who have signed up, we're going to Shiloh. I'm not sure whether I'm looking forward to the battle or the catfish. If you have not signed up and you've never eaten at Hagee's Catfish Hotel, you need to do that. They got other stuff besides catfish, but I don't know why you'd go there unless you get the catfish. Chicken livers are good. They got pie. Holy smokes. It's got some of the best pie, and their hush puppies. I was going to say hush puppies. Mike Kraft called me. He said, y'all going to Hagee's? I think Mike offered to drive the bus if he could get up to Hagee's. Y'all have a great day. Thank y'all for being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you.